50 below zero, a wall of white, 3 people buried alive under 10 feet of solid, unforgiving snow. They didn't have a satellite beacon, they lacked proper winter gear, and nobody knew their exact route. All they had was a dead SUV and a desperate primal will to survive. The drive from Denver to a small, off-the-grid cabin near Silverton was supposed to be a chance for the Reynolds family to heal. It was mid-November 2014. Thomas Reynolds, a 42-year-old structural engineer, gripped the leather steering wheel of his 2011 Ford Expedition with white knuckles. In the passenger seat sat his younger brother Benjamin, 38, a former heavy machinery mechanic whose life had been a series of starts and stops. In the back, huddled beneath a thin fleece blanket and listening to music through her headphones, was Thomas's 15-year-old daughter Chloe. The tension in the heavy SUV was already thick before the first snowflake fell. Thomas and Benjamin hadn't spoken much since their father's funeral 3 months prior, and this trip was a strained attempt at reconciliation. But nature, it seemed, cared little for their family dynamics. The main highway had been shut down due to an overturned semi-truck spilling hazardous materials across the ice-slicked asphalt. Stubborn and driven by a rigid schedule, Thomas made a fateful decision. He took a detour onto a treacherous, winding mountain pass, a remote logging road that local ranchers warned against using past October. "I don't like this, Tommy," Benjamin muttered, peering through the windshield as the afternoon sky abruptly turned the color of bruised iron. "The altimeter on my watch says we're pushing 10,000 feet. The clouds are dropping fast." "The GPS says it's only 30 miles to the county road," Thomas replied, his jaw set. "We have 4-wheel drive. We'll be fine." He was wrong. Within 20 minutes, the light flurry transformed into a blinding, ferocious squall. The wind howled through the pines like a choir of banshees, violently shaking the heavy SUV. The temperature plummeted so rapidly that the windshield wipers began to freeze to the glass, fighting a losing battle against the rapidly accumulating ice. Visibility dropped to absolute zero. It was a complete whiteout. "Dad, I'm scared," Chloe said, pulling her headphones down. Her voice trembled over the roar of the heater. "We can't even see the road." "Just hold on, sweetie," Thomas said, leaning forward, his chest almost touching the steering wheel. They were creeping along at barely 5 miles an hour, hugging what Thomas prayed was the side of the mountain and not the edge of a precipice. Then a sound completely cut through the mechanical hum of the engine and the howling wind. It was a deep, guttural crack, followed by a resonant boom that vibrated in their chest cavities. "Brake!" Benjamin screamed. "Hit the brakes!" Before Thomas's foot could even slam the pedal to the floor, the world tilted sideways. A massive cornice of snow, weakened by the sudden storm, had broken loose from the ridge above. It wasn't a sprawling, catastrophic avalanche, but a dense, localized slide, a terrifying tidal wave of compacted ice rocks and heavy wet snow. The impact was deafening. The Ford Expedition was shoved violently to the right, the tires completely leaving the ground. Metal groaned and shrieked as the passenger side slammed against the rocky embankment of the mountain face. Then, darkness. Instant, suffocating darkness. The snow had entirely consumed them. The heavy avalanche debris rushed over the roof, piling 10 feet high, and instantly sealing the vehicle in a concrete-like tomb. Inside the cabin, the sudden silence was terrifying. The engine had stalled. The only sound was the frantic, shallow breathing of the 3 passengers. "Chloe!" Thomas yelled, twisting violently in his seat, ignoring the sharp pain in his shoulder. "Chloe, are you hurt?" "I'm okay, Dad. I'm okay. What happened? It's so dark," she cried out. Benjamin unbuckled his seatbelt, his hands shaking in the pitch black. He fumbled for his cell phone and hit the lock button, The harsh blue light illuminated the terrifying reality of their situation. Snow was packed tightly against every single window. The glass on the passenger side was cracked into a spiderweb pattern, bowing inward from the immense pressure. But miraculously it had held. Thomas immediately reached for the ignition. "I need to start the engine. We need heat and headlights." "No." Benjamin lunged across the center console, his larger, rougher hands clamping down on his brother's wrist with surprising force. "Do not turn that key, Tommy. Do not do it." "Let go of me, Ben. It's freezing in here." "Think about it, you idiot." Benjamin roared, the panic bleeding into his voice. "We are buried. The exhaust pipe is packed with snow. You turn that engine on, the carbon monoxide will back up into the cabin. We'll fall asleep in 10 minutes and never wake up. The engine stays off." Thomas froze, the realization washing over him like ice water. He slowly pulled his hand away from the keys. The blue light from Benjamin's phone screen cast long skeletal shadows across their faces. They were in a metal box trapped under 10 feet of snow, miles from any main road, completely invisible to the outside world. The first 48 hours were a masterclass in psychological torture. The initial adrenaline wore off, replaced by the creeping, agonizing reality of the cold. The temperature inside the expedition dropped steadily, mirroring the sub-zero blizzard raging somewhere far above them. Their breath plumed in the darkness, settling as condensation on the interior roof, and instantly freezing into jagged little stalactites of ice. They took a desperate inventory of their supplies. It was grim. Because they were only planning for a 6-hour drive, they hadn't packed a winter survival kit. They had 2 thin fleece blankets, a single ice scraper, a half-empty pack of gum, 3 granola bars, and a 6-pack of bottled water. "We need to conserve everything," Thomas said, his teeth chattering uncontrollably. He had wrapped Chloe in both blankets, holding her tightly against his chest in the back seat, to share body heat. No one eats unless they feel like they're going to pass out. We take sips of water, not gulps. But the water was becoming a problem. By the end of the second day, the plastic bottles were freezing solid. Benjamin had to tuck them inside his jacket, pressing the freezing plastic against his bare skin just to melt enough ice for them to take a sip. The air was another pressing issue. The cabin was well sealed, which meant oxygen was slowly depleting. The air grew stale, heavy, and tasted metallic. They were developing splitting headaches, a classic sign of carbon dioxide buildup. "We have to vent the car," Benjamin announced on the morning of day 3. At least they assumed it was morning. The darkness was absolute and eternal. Benjamin's phone had died on day 2. The car battery was strictly reserved for turning on the dome light for 2 minutes every 12 hours to check for frostbite. "If we open a window, the snow will pour in, Ben," Thomas argued weakly. "If we don't, we suffocate. I'm going to crack the sunroof." Just a fraction. Using the emergency manual crank he found in the glove compartment, Benjamin forced the sunroof open, a mere half-inch. The snow above had compacted and hardened into ice, creating a dense ceiling. Using the plastic ice scraper and a ballpoint pen, Benjamin painstakingly chipped away at the ice crust above the gap, digging upward for 3 agonizing hours, until he felt a sudden rush of frigid, impossibly fresh air hit his face. He had managed to create a small 2-inch-wide air shaft to the surface. "I got it." Benjamin gasped, his hands raw and bleeding. "We have air." But the victory was short-lived. The influx of fresh air also meant the total loss of what little residual warmth they had trapped inside. The temperature in the cabin hit 20 degrees below zero. It was time to tear the car apart. Benjamin, relying on his years working in auto shops, started systematically dismantling the interior of the expensive SUV. "Sorry about the resale value, Tommy," he grunted in the dark. Using a pocket knife, He slashed open the leather seats, pulling out handfuls of the dense yellow polyurethane foam. They stuffed the foam into their jackets and pants, creating a crude, itchy layer of artificial blubber. They ripped up the floor mats, using the heavy rubber to cover the cracked, freezing windows, creating a thermal barrier between the glass and the interior. Despite their efforts, the cold began to claim its toll. On day 5, Chloe fell ill. It started as a persistent cough, exacerbated by the freezing air and the lingering moisture in the cabin. By day 6, she was burning up with a terrifying, paradoxical fever. Her body shivered violently, her lips cracked and bleeding. "Dad, my chest hurts." She whimpered, her voice barely a whisper in the pitch black. "It hurts to breathe." Thomas was frantic. The polished, controlled engineer was crumbling. He held her tightly, weeping silently in the dark, rocking her back and forth. "I'm so sorry, Chloe. I'm so sorry I brought us here." Benjamin listened to his brother break down his own heart, heavy with a terrifying realization. They were dying. Slowly, surely the icebox was claiming them. Then, on the night of the 7th day, a new horror introduced itself. The storm above had finally broken. The agonizing silence of their snowy tomb was interrupted by a sound from above. It was a soft, crunching noise. Crunch, crunch, crunch. Footsteps on the snow crust directly over the roof of the car. Thomas stopped rocking Chloe. Benjamin sat dead still in the driver's seat, his hand instinctively gripping the useless pocket knife. The crunching stopped right above the tiny air shaft Benjamin had dug. Then came the sniffing. It was heavy, guttural, and hungry. A wet, ragged breath echoed down the small tunnel, carrying with it the distinct, foul odor of rotting meat. Whatever was up there was large, desperate, and it smelled them. Suddenly a massive paw slammed down, collapsing the top of their fragile air vent. Snow showered down through the cracked sunroof, hitting Benjamin in the face. The beast began to furiously dig at the snow, trying to widen the hole, trying to reach the prey buried below. The metal roof of the expedition groaned under the sudden violent weight of the predator. The massive weight pressing down on the Ford expedition sent a terrifying metallic screech echoing through the confined cabin. The roof bowed inward, the reinforced steel struggling to support both the 10 feet of compacted snow and the colossal beast digging desperately from above. "Dad!" Chloe shrieked, her voice raspy and weak from the fever. "Quiet!" Benjamin hissed, his entire body coiled like a spring. He stood on the center console, balancing precariously in the pitch black, his face inches from the crushed sunroof. The freezing air rushing through the tiny ruined vent brought with it the overwhelming stench of wet fur, musk, and old blood. It was a black bear. Unseasonably warm temperatures in early November must have delayed its hibernation, and the sudden brutal blizzard had trapped it starving and desperate. It had smelled them. It had smelled prey. A massive clawed paw, thick as a tree trunk, shoved its way into the narrow opening, tearing away chunks of the ice crust. A clump of snow hit Benjamin directly in the eyes, but he didn't blink. He gripped his folding pocket knife, the 3-inch blade locked and pointed upward. A wet black snout pushed into the hole, violently snorting and inhaling the warm, foul air of the cabin. "Hey!" Benjamin roared, a primal, guttural sound that tore at his own vocal cords. He thrust the knife upward with every ounce of strength left in his freezing, atrophied muscles. The blade buried itself to the hilt in the soft, sensitive cartilage of the bear's snout. A deafening, earth-shattering roar vibrated through the car, loud enough to make Thomas's ears ring. The beast violently jerked its head back, ripping the knife from Benjamin's numb fingers. The sudden thrashing movement caused a localized collapse of the snowpack. Heavy chunks of ice and powder cascaded through the sunroof, burying the front seats in a miniature avalanche. Above them they could hear the heavy, frantic scrambling of the wounded animal, retreating up the mountain, its angry roars fading into the howling wind. Benjamin collapsed backward into the passenger seat, gasping for air, his hands trembling violently. "It's gone! It's gone!" But the victory was a hollow one. The bear had completely collapsed their makeshift air vent. The cabin was sealed tight once more, and the influx of snow had dropped the interior temperature to a lethal 25 degrees below zero. "Ben the vent!" Thomas whispered, his teeth chattering so hard he could barely form the words. "I can't dig it out again, Tommy." Benjamin sobbed, his bravado finally breaking. "My hands. I can't feel my hands. We lost the scraper. We lost the knife." Despair, thick and suffocating, settled over them. By day 8, the oxygen depletion was severe. Lethargy was replacing panic. Chloe was slipping in and out of consciousness, her breathing terribly shallow. Her fever was a roaring inferno in the freezing dark. Thomas held his daughter, resting his chin on her matted hair. He was failing her. The logical, meticulous engineer had driven them into a tomb. As his brain starved for oxygen, his thoughts became disjointed, bouncing between memories of his late father and the blueprints of the high-rise he was supposed to be building in Denver. Blueprints, schematics, the truck. Thomas's eyes snapped open in the darkness. A sudden jolting surge of adrenaline cut through the hypoxia. "Ben!" Thomas croaked, his voice barely audible. "Ben, wake up!" "Leave me alone," Benjamin mumbled, deep in the dangerous, seductive sleep of hypothermia. "Ben, the lockbox. The sight box," Thomas yelled, slapping his brother's shoulder. When Thomas visited remote construction sites in the Rockies, company protocol mandated a heavy-duty emergency lockbox bolted to the chassis in the cargo area of his SUV. He had completely forgotten about it. It was out of sight, out of mind, hidden behind the third row of seats. "The trunk," Benjamin slurred, slowly sitting up. "We can't open the hatch. There's 10 feet of snow against it." "We don't go outside. We go through the seats." It took them 4 agonizing hours, working in absolute darkness, battling exhaustion, freezing temperatures, and burning lungs. The two brothers tore the interior of the car to shreds. They ripped the leather, shattered the plastic paneling, and used the metal legs of the detached headrests as crowbars to forcefully unlatch and fold down the rear seats. Finally, Thomas's bleeding fingers brushed against the freezing heavy steel of the lockbox. "I found it," he wept. The combination lock was frozen solid. Benjamin, using his bare hands, cupped the metal dial, breathing warm air onto it, using the friction of his own skin to melt the rime ice. After 30 excruciating minutes, the dial clicked. Thomas threw open the heavy lid. Inside, he blindly felt around until his fingers wrapped around a hard plastic cylinder. He twisted the top. A blinding, searing white light exploded in the cabin. It was an emergency LED lantern. For the first time in over a week, they saw each other. The sight was horrifying. They were gaunt, their skin a pale, sickly blue, their lips cracked and bleeding eyes sunken deep into their skulls. But the light revealed salvation. Inside the steel box was a treasure trove of survival gear. 3 professional-grade sub-zero thermal foil sleeping bags, a large medical kit, water purification tablets, a hand-crank emergency radio, and most importantly, 40,000 calories worth of dense, vacuum-sealed SOS emergency survival rations. Thomas ripped open the medical kit. Antibiotics, broad-spectrum amoxicillin. It's for field infections, but it might break her fever. He crushed the pills and mixed them with a precious few drops of melted snow, forcing the paste past Chloe's cracked lips. Then they unrolled the thermal sleeping bags, pulling the highly reflective foil around themselves, trapping their escaping body heat. They ate their first meal in 8 days. The dense, vanilla-flavored shortbread rations tasted like dirt and chalk, but to their starving bodies, it was a feast. "We have air to fix next," Benjamin said, his voice gaining a fraction of its old strength. Using a sturdy metal wrench from the sight box, he systematically pounded the crushed snow out of the sunroof, packing it into the empty footwells of the car until the 2-inch shaft to the surface was clear once more. Fresh freezing air poured in, but this time shielded by the thermal bags they could endure it. "We have food. We have bags. We have light," Thomas said, looking at his brother. Benjamin nodded slowly. "Now we just have to wait." Waiting became an agonizing marathon of mental endurance. Days bled into weeks. The blizzard of November gave way to the deep, bone-cracking freezes of December. The snowpack above them hardened from powder to a dense, glacial ice entombing the Ford expedition in a frozen vault. Their world was reduced to the 80 cubic feet of the SUV's cabin. They fell into a grim, monotonous routine to preserve their sanity and their dwindling resources. They lived on exactly 400 calories a day. Hydration was a constant, exhausting chore. They took turns holding cups of snow against their stomachs, inside their thermal bags, using their own body heat to melt the ice into drinking water. Chloe's fever broke on day 12, a minor miracle attributed to the emergency antibiotics, but the damp, freezing conditions left her with a brutal, persistent cough. To keep their minds from snapping in the suffocating darkness, they only used the lantern for 5 minutes a day to conserve its battery, they talked. The walls between the estranged brothers crumbled under the weight of the ice. Thomas confessed his overwhelming guilt for prioritizing his career over his family, admitting that the rigid schedule that drove them into the storm was a byproduct of his own anxiety. Benjamin, in turn, opened up about his struggles with addiction and the deep-seated shame he felt comparing his disjointed life to Thomas's perceived success. "You kept us alive, Ben," Thomas whispered one night, the temperature outside hovering at 30 below zero. "I would have turned that key. I would have killed us on day 1. You're the one who knew what to do." "You're the one who packed the box, Tommy," Benjamin replied from his foil cocoon. "We're a team. Always should have been." By late January, the physical toll was becoming catastrophic. Despite the rations, their bodies were consuming their own muscle mass to stay warm. Their joints ached fiercely, a symptom of early scurvy. Their teeth felt loose. The cabin reeked of unwashed bodies, stale breath, and the harsh chemical scent of the waste bucket they had fashioned from a plastic storage bin. The sheer weight of the accumulated winter snow began to test the structural integrity of the vehicle. In mid-February, a loud pistol crack sound echoed through the cabin. The rear windshield had finally imploded under the pressure. Thousands of shards of tempered glass rained down on the cargo area, followed by a slow, creeping intrusion of packed snow. Panic flared, but they quickly used the heavy rubber floor mats and the empty steel lockbox to build a crude barricade, shoring up the rear compartment and stopping the ice from filling the cabin. But the collapse forced them closer together, shrinking their already tiny world. In early March, something fundamental changed. The pitch-black darkness that had been their constant companion for over 100 days began to shift. It wasn't a sudden burst of light, but a faint, ethereal blue glow seeping through the ice crust above the sunroof. "Look," Chloe whispered, her voice barely a rasp. She pointed a skeletal, trembling finger upward. "The sun," Thomas breathed. "The snow is thinning." The agonizingly slow arrival of spring brought its own terrifying dangers. As the temperatures outside began to rise above freezing during the day, the glacier surrounding them began to melt. Water, relentless, freezing water, started to drip into the cabin. First a drop, then a steady trickle. everything became soaked. The thermal bags lost their effectiveness when wet and the threat of severe hypothermia returned with a vengeance. Worse, the melting snowpack shifted. The massive weight above them grew unbalanced. The roof of the expedition groaned continuously, the metal buckling downward, threatening to crush them completely. Thomas, using his engineering background, knew the car frame was failing. They had to brace the roof. They found the heavy-duty hydraulic jack in the side panel of the trunk. Placing it on the center console, they pumped the handle, wedging the thick metal rod against the reinforced crossbar of the roof. It held. The roof stopped sagging, suspended just inches above their heads by the strength of the hydraulic piston. By the first week of April, the blue glow above had turned into a blinding, diffused white. They could hear the distant, muffled sound of rushing water, snowmelt flowing down the mountain. They were down to their last 3 survival bars. They hadn't spoken in 2 days, lacking the energy to even move their jaws. Thomas lay with his eyes closed, listening to the rhythmic dripping of water, wondering if this was the week the roof would finally cave in, or if starvation would claim them first. Then a new sound cut through the dripping. It was mechanical, a high-pitched, whining roar that grew steadily louder. Benjamin's eyes snapped open. Engine. It was a snowmobile. Local search and rescue volunteer Arthur Mitchell was conducting routine spring clearance on the high logging trails. The area was notoriously dangerous during the spring melt, prone to massive mudslides and late-season avalanches. Arthur was carefully navigating his ski-doo around a massive melting snowdrift when a flash of unnatural reflection caught his eye. He cut the engine. The silence of the mountain returned, save for the dripping water. He waded through waist-deep, slushy snow toward the anomaly. Sticking out of the melting ice, catching the harsh midday sun, was the jagged, broken edge of a side-view mirror attached to a metallic blue door frame. Arthur pulled his emergency radio from his harness. "Dispatch, this is Rescue 2. I've got a vehicle buried at Marker 4 on the Ridge Trail. Looks like it's been here all winter. Going to investigate." Arthur grabbed his avalanche shovel and began to dig furiously. The snow was heavy and wet. He cleared the driver's side window, finding it completely blocked by black rubber on the inside. He pounded on the glass with the handle of his shovel. Inside the tomb, the sound was like a bomb going off. Thomas jerked upright, his heart hammering against his ribs. Benjamin scrambled toward the front seat, his weak, atrophied limbs shaking. He grabbed the heavy metal wrench and smashed it against the cracked window glass. Thump! 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 Arthur stopped digging. He pressed his ear against the cold glass. Faintly, incredibly faintly, he heard the rhythmic, desperate tapping from inside. "Dispatch!" Arthur screamed into his radio, his voice cracking with sheer disbelief. "Dispatch, I have survivors. I repeat, I have survivors inside the vehicle. Send a medevac chopper right now. Bring the jaws of life." It took 2 hours for the rescue team to arrive and cut away the roof of the SUV. When the heavy steel was finally peeled back, the blinding, agonizingly bright light of the April sun flooded the cabin. Dr. Helen Rostova, part of the medevac crew, dropped into the crater of snow, her eyes widening in absolute shock at the scene before her. The interior of the car looked like a war zone, slashed seats, a hydraulic jack holding up the ceiling, and 3 skeletal figures huddled together in foil blankets. Thomas squinted against the light shielding Chloe's eyes with his trembling hand. He looked up at Dr. Rostova, his face streaked with dirt, and tears, his lips cracking into the faintest of smiles. "Spring," he whispered, his voice raspy and broken. "Is it spring?" Dr. Rostova nodded, fighting back her own tears as she signaled the backboard team. "Yes, sir. It's spring. You made it. You're going home." They had been trapped inside the metal icebox for 142 days. Through a combination of sheer mechanical luck, hidden provisions, and an unbreakable fraternal bond, the Reynolds family had defied the impossible. They had been swallowed by the mountain, buried alive under 10 feet of ice, and against every known law of survival, they had waited the winter out. The incredible survival of the Reynolds family proves that the human will to live is stronger than the harshest elements on Earth. Their harrowing 142-day ordeal under the ice is a masterclass in resilience, quick thinking, and the power of hope. If this jaw-dropping story of survival kept you on the edge of your seat, hit that like button, share it with your friends, and subscribe for more unbelievable true stories.